When you picture the end of the cowboy era, what do you see? The last gunslinger in a noble final stand against the coming tide of civilization. His world of open plains and endless freedom vanishing in a haze of gun smoke. It's one of America's most powerful stories, told in 100 movies and 1,000 books. It is also almost completely false. The real end of the American cowboy wasn't a dramatic showdown. It was a slow, agonizing collapse. It wasn't a story about bullets, but about balance sheets. Not about outlaws, but about overgrazing. And the final blow wasn't a gunfight, but a terrifying apocalyptic blizzard that brought an entire industry to its knees. This is the forgotten story of how the cowboy era truly ended, and what rose from the ashes to create the American West we know today. It's a story of greed, technology, and a devastating collision with nature. If you enjoy uncovering the real history behind the legends of the Old West, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. Part 1. The Gold Rush on Hooves. The iconic American cowboy didn't ride out of timeless tradition. He was born from a 25-year economic boom that started right after the Civil War. The war had created a massive imbalance. In the industrial North, beef was scarce and in high demand, with a single steer fetching as much as $40 or $50. Meanwhile, down in Texas, the situation was the exact opposite. Herds of tough Spanish longhorn cattle, left to themselves during the war, had multiplied into the millions. With the southern economy destroyed, these longhorns were worth as little as $3 to $5 a head. A fortune was just sitting there, waiting for anyone who could figure out how to get all that cheap beef up north. The solution was the railroad, which was pushing its iron rails west across the plains. An Illinois livestock trader named Joseph McCoy had a brilliant idea. He knew that if Texas cattle could be driven north to meet the new railways in Kansas, they could be shipped directly to the giant meatpacking plants in Chicago. In 1867, he turned the tiny village of Abilene, Kansas, into the very first cow town, complete with stockyards and a hotel. He advertised fair prices, and the floodgates opened. This was the beginning of the Beef Bonanza. The great cattle drives had begun. These drives were epic journeys. A trail crew of about a dozen cowboys would move 2,000 to 3,000 head of cattle 1,000 miles north, grazing them along the way. They followed legendary routes like the Chisholm Trail to Abilene, and later the Western Trail to Dodge City. The cowboy was the essential gear in this giant machine. He was a low-cost mobile worker who made the whole supply chain possible. His tools, from his lariat to his saddle, were inherited directly from the Spanish and Mexican vaqueros who had been working cattle in the Southwest for centuries. Life on the trail was not romantic. It was weeks of grueling, monotonous work, choking on dust at the back of the herd for about $1 a day. That monotony was broken only by moments of pure terror. Violent thunderstorms, treacherous river crossings, and the constant threat of a stampede which could crush a man or horse in an instant. Part 2. The cracks begin to show. For a while, the system worked like a dream. The profits were so immense that a speculative fever swept across the country and even over to Europe. Eastern and British investors, who knew nothing about ranching, poured millions into giant cattle corporations, hoping to get rich off free grass on the American plains. This flood of money led to a single disastrous decision: reckless overstocking. Everyone wanted to put as many cattle as possible onto the free public grasslands to maximize their profits. By the mid-1880s, the western ranges were dangerously overcrowded, with some estimates putting the number of cattle at 40 million. The fragile prairie grasses, which had evolved with bison, were eaten down to the roots and trampled into dust. This created a classic tragedy of the commons. Every rancher, acting in his own short-term interest, helped destroy the very resource the entire industry depended on. The inevitable result was that the market was flooded with beef and prices crashed. While the cattle barons were destroying their world from within, two new technologies were closing in from the outside. The first was a simple invention that changed everything: barbed wire, patented in 1874. The devil's rope finally gave people a cheap and easy way to fence the vast treeless plains. This invention fundamentally changed the West from a public commons into a checkerboard of private property. Farmers and homesteaders, encouraged by the Homestead Act of 1862, began fencing their plots to protect their crops from roaming herds. At the same time, big cattle companies started illegally fencing off huge areas of public land, especially around water sources, to monopolize the range. This sparked violent range wars, where masked gangs rode at night, cutting miles of fences in a guerrilla war over land and water. The final nail in the coffin of the long drive was the very technology that created it, the railroad. As the rail network expanded in the 1870s and 80s, pushing deeper and deeper into Texas and across the West, it eliminated the need for the epic drives. Why drive your cattle 1,000 miles to Kansas when you could drive them 100 miles, or even 50, to a local depot and ship them by train? The iron horse, once the cowboy's greatest ally, had made his primary skill obsolete. Part 3. The Winter That Killed the Cowboy. The open-range cattle kingdom was already weakened by greed and technology, but the winter of 1886 to 1887 was the catastrophic event that broke its neck. It became known as the Great Die-Up, and it was a final, brutal reckoning for years of ignoring the laws of nature. The summer of 1886 had been brutally hot and dry. The overgrazed plains had almost no grass left. Cattle went into the autumn already weak and malnourished. Because beef prices were low, ranchers held back even more cattle from the market, further crowding the barren land. The big corporately owned ranches had become complacent after a few mild winters and hadn't bothered to store hay for winter feed. The entire system was a house of cards, ready to be blown over by a single powerful gust of wind. That storm hit in January of 1887. A massive blizzard buried the northern plains in over a foot of snow, with winds so strong and temperatures so cold they dropped to 50 degrees below zero. The cattle's natural instinct was to drift south, away from the storm, to find shelter. But now, their path was blocked by the new barbed wire drift fences that ranchers had stretched for hundreds of miles. The desperate animals piled up against the fences by the thousands, where they were crushed or simply froze to death in huge silent mounds. One man reported finding 250 carcasses for every mile along a 35-mile stretch of fence. Then the weather played a final, cruel trick. A brief warm spell melted the top layer of snow, which was immediately followed by another Arctic blast that froze it into a solid sheet of ice. The remaining grass was now sealed away, impossible to reach. The starving cattle began to die in unimaginable numbers. A young rancher in the Dakota Territory, Theodore Roosevelt, lost more than half his herd. He wrote to a friend, "Well, we have had a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country." When spring finally came, the scene was apocalyptic. Millions of rotting carcasses choked the rivers and streams. Across the northern plains, ranchers lost between 50 and 90% of their herds. The great cattle companies, especially those funded by faraway investors, were completely ruined. The Beef Bonanza was over. Part 4, The Ghost and the Hired Hand. The Great Die-Up was not just an end. It was a violent, cleansing fire that forced the birth of a new, modern form of ranching. The survivors abandoned the reckless ways of the open range and created a more sustainable system based on control and management. The era of unfenced empires was over, replaced by smaller enclosed ranches on private land. This new model was built on 3 key things. First, fences, which were now used to manage pastures and control breeding. Second, winter feed. Ranchers began growing and storing hay to make sure their herds could survive the winters. And third, the windmill, which allowed ranchers to pump their own water, freeing them from relying on rivers that could run dry or be fenced off. They also began replacing the tough, stringy longhorns with European breeds like Hereford and Angus, which produced better beef. This revolution completely changed the cowboy's job. The long, adventurous cattle drive was a thing of the past. The cowboy was no longer a nomadic drover. He became a stationary ranch hand, a hired man on horseback. His new job involved mending fences, harvesting hay, and doing general farm labor. The epic was over. What was left was just a job. And here's the greatest irony of all. Just as the real world of the open-range cowboy was vanishing, his myth was just being born. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the American frontier was officially closed. As the nation became more settled and industrialized, it developed a deep, nostalgic craving for the wild, free world that was gone forever. The cowboy became the symbol of that lost world. Dime novels had already started turning the low-wage worker into a heroic gunslinger. Starting in 1883, Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows turned that myth into a global entertainment spectacle, with real cowboys performing staged feats of skill. And finally, the brand new movie industry seized on the Western, cementing the image of the lone, heroic cowboy as the ultimate symbol of American freedom, a symbol that would shape how America saw itself for the next 100 years. The nation forgot the complex reality of a failed economic system and chose to remember the romantic legend instead. The real cowboy's world was gone. But his ghost, larger than life, continues to ride across the open range of our imagination. What part of this real story surprised you the most compared to the movies you've seen? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.